Well, this is going to be a little bit of a different kind of a sermon, actually. And the reason I decided to share a message on whether or not God exists and then how do we respond to that is because some Christian leaders who I respect have mentioned that it's often kind of assumed that we just all believe in God, and that it's very, very rare that a sermon is preached that deal with some of these very, very foundational kinds of questions. And, I'm a teacher, of course, at the Christian high school. And sometimes I get a student that comes into grade 9. And although this student might be just a really nice young man or a nice young woman coming out of a good family, living a morally upright life, sometimes some of these students have decided already that there isn't a God. And of course, that's concerning to me and, of course, to all of us. So I thought I would spend some time dealing with that particular topic. Now, for those of you who had me as a teacher, and there's quite a few of you out here in the room, some of what I shared this morning you'll have heard before, so you'll just have to kind of bear with me. But we live in a time when there's a significant number of sort of what we would call sort of the movers and shakers in this world. You know, the opinion setters, the professors at universities and journalists and other shapers of public opinion don't believe in God. They're in the minority, in the distinct minority, but they have a lot of influence. You know, and that's been that way for some time. I think of this gentleman here, Friedrich Nietzsche. He, who lived well over 100 years ago, he was one of the guys that first kind of said really clearly there isn't a God. In fact, he coined this phrase. He said, God is dead. God has died. And that Time magazine cover you see there on the slide, I remember that thing coming to my house when I was a boy. And I remember being kind of disturbed by that. So there's a guy years ago already that started to say that. And of course, he's definitely not alone. And more recently, we've had a number of people who are sometimes called the new atheists who have been very, very, very strident about the fact that there isn't a God. A guy like Richard Dawkins, who wrote this book, The God Delusion, a few years ago. And yeah, he thinks it's not only foolish to believe in a God, but probably even kind of dangerous in some ways. And even the late Stephen Hawking, brilliant man. But as it says here, and this is a quote from something he said once, heaven is a fairy story for those afraid of the dark. So there's a lot of smart people out there that say there isn't a God. And that's challenging for us. It really is. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that this morning, some reasons why we should believe in a God. And actually, in some ways, it's getting easier. It's not like we have to sort of believe on blind faith. Now, there's all kinds of rational, sensible reasons to believe in a God. In fact, I increasingly think it makes more sense to believe in a God. It's easier to believe in a God than not to believe in a God. But just before we start, just a couple of disclaimers. One, I only have a little bit of time, so I'm only going to scratch the surface. And also, I'm not that brilliant. And there's many other people that I can refer to you later that have much more profound things to say, and I can share you some names and books and so on if you so like. At any rate, as we look at why we should believe in a God, I'm not going to only spend the sermon on that. I'm also going to, at the end, deal with how do we respond to the fact that there's a God. But one of the areas that we probably want to especially zero in on is what's sometimes called the cosmological argument. That's a big word, but what it really means is what we've, in this verse that was already read earlier. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. You know, this world that you and I live in is incredibly complex. And everything is interconnected. There's all these ecosystems and everything needs everything else. And the more you study things and the more scientists discover, the more they discover that things that they thought were simple are actually really, really complicated. I remember first sort of realizing that when I was studying science in high school, and for some reason or other when we studied the muscle and how muscle tissue is put together and how it all works. And muscles seemed to me like something pretty simple. And yet it was incredibly complex. And I remember thinking already then as a teenager, how could anybody say that this just sort of happened? And so the complexity of the universe is something that points to a creator. And something I don't know too much about, and it's only been something people have been talking about the last 30 years or so, but there's something that scientists call the fine-tuning of the universe. It's kind of like this. If the whole universe is sort of like what do we call it? Kind of like a room full of machines, or sort of like a little environment all by itself, like a greenhouse or something like that, and you wanted to set things up in such a way that it would flourish, and you have all these dials where you can set all these different kinds of things, like just how strong the power of gravity is going to be, or, and I don't even know why this is important, but the ratio of the masses of protons to electrons, or how hydrogen converts to helium, which evidently is basic to life in this world that we live in. But if you take all those different things and you have to, put them all into just the precise spot, put all the dials in the right place, I'm told that they have to be extremely precise, that if they're off just a little bit, life wouldn't exist. And that's challenging for those who would say that everything just sort of happened willy-nilly, random. You know, the incredible complexity of the universe, and I should just quote one other guy who talks about this a minute. This is a quote from a scientist who's definitely not a Christian. He teaches at Cambridge. Pretty smart people teach at Cambridge. And he says, for instance, if you change a little bit the laws of nature, or you change a little bit the constants of nature, like the charge on the electron, then the way the universe develops is so changed, it's very unlikely that intelligent life would not have been able to develop. You know, normally, when you and I find something, we discover something which is beautifully designed and intricately designed, we don't think that just sort of happens sort of spontaneously. When something is really, really wonderfully designed, it points to a designer. And that's one of the foundational arguments for the fact that there has to be a God. And one other little thing, and how important this is, I don't know, but those who would like to eliminate God from the picture completely like to say that this whole universe came into being via a Big Bang. And maybe there was some kind of a Big Bang. I don't know. I'm not much of a scientist, really. I'm a history guy. But the Big Bang theory, as I understand it, says that all the mass of the universe, everything that exists, was at one point all pushed down into some incredibly dense spot, like a dot. And then suddenly it went boom and exploded, and we got all the parts of the universe. And that's an explanation, but that still doesn't settle the question at all of where things came from. Because I don't care how tightly you can pack the universe into one little spot, it's all there, and we still wonder, where did that come from? Where did all that stuff come from? You don't get something from nothing. Well, a second argument for the fact that there has to be a God is sometimes called the moral argument. And earlier on, Benna read Psalm 14, verse 1, where it says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." And as you continue to read that particular psalm, you'll discover that this person who doesn't believe in a God or doesn't want there to be a God says that because they want to live the way they want to live. Or I think of a well-known atheist from a generation ago, Aldous Huxley, in a moment of candor, I think it was in a private letter that was later published, admitted that he didn't want there to be a God. Because if there was a God, he couldn't live the way he wanted to live, which included very much an immoral lifestyle. And more recently, We had this campaign led by Richard Dawkins in England, and you see that sign there, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." They had that campaign in England maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago, and they put those kinds of signs on some of those red buses they have over there and on some billboards. And there too, you can see, they think that it'd be nicer without a God because they find God, the reality of God, to be something restrictive. But when you start to step back and talk about right and wrong and about what God has to do with all of this, a good question to ask is, why should we be good? Why should you be nice to people? Like, why? Because it's the right thing to do? Says who? Who says you should be nice to people? Why is that logical? I think you could argue that that's illogical. If this world came about through a process of evolution, that assumes that everything in this universe is in conflict with everything else, and the strongest survive and the weak become extinct. That's the basic way the universe unfolds. That's the basic way the universe lives out. So shouldn't we just live that way in our own lives? Shouldn't we who are stronger and smarter and have more power step on those who are less than us? Isn't that logical? Isn't that the way the universe operates? And yet, all of us, whoever we are, wherever we come from, understand that we can't live that way. That there is a right and wrong. That we need to look out for others. We need to look out for the weaker. That if we don't, there's something very wrong, and we're going to experience guilt. And so, that's something to think about. Just maybe one more slide here I almost forgot about. Richard Dawkins, same guy. He agrees with what I just said in terms of where you're at if you're an atheist. He says here, much as we might wish to believe otherwise, universal love and the welfare of the species as a whole are concepts which simply do not make evolutionary sense. So I'm not just making up what I said. It is logical to not care if there is no God and if this world is just sort of a natural but just evolved the way that it evolved. But there are standards. We have a sense of right and wrong. In fact, the major world religions all kind of agree on basic moral standards. And all the world's religions, they agree you just can't go kill somebody because you don't like them. You can't just go take somebody's stuff just because you want it. You just can't have sex with whoever you feel like. And, you don't applaud cowards. All those sort of basic things, all the religions of the world agree on. But the moral standards that we agree on actually contradict our feelings. They go against our feelings often. Because the moral standards often say, in fact, usually say, we need to do things, or we shouldn't do things, whatever the case might be, that we actually would like to do the opposite. They challenge our feelings. And actually, these moral standards that we agree on are also higher than what any person is ever able to actually obey. So that's interesting. Why would the whole world have moral standards which challenge our feelings, challenge our nature, and are also higher and more challenging than what anybody ever lives? Where'd they come from? Why did we invent such standards? Well, the scriptures say this, Romans 2. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law, that is, who do not have the Bible, are not familiar with the scriptures, do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. It's written inside somehow. Their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. A third thing that's often pointed to as to why it makes sense to believe in God is this whole idea of a sense of meaning and purpose. If there is no God, if there is no spiritual dimension to reality, if all there is the physical world, each of us here are just a bunch of atoms and molecules that got put together for no apparent reason. They just sort of accidentally, you got to be what you are. It also means that your life and my life has no purpose whatsoever, no ultimate significance. And someday, each of us are just going to die, and that'll be it. And we know that that can't be true. We know that we yearn for significance. We yearn for meaning. And when we bury someone that we love, we know that that's not just the end of them. You can't live believing that we're just a bunch of molecules, that we have no significance, that there's no rhyme nor reason to this world. Even the most hardened atheist can't really live that way. And to me, that's one of the more foundational reasons why I believe that there's a God. So those are some of the strongest arguments that people will sometimes use for why there's a God, why it makes sense to believe in there's a God. But there's a few other ones we can just maybe mention here briefly as well. What about other things that we believe in without having seen the proof ourselves? Because we do accept a lot of stuff by faith. I mean, people say, I've never seen God, so how can there be a God? Well, I think you guys all believe that the earth goes around the sun rather than the sun around the earth. You all believe that, even though it looks like the opposite is true? Why do you believe that? Is it because you figured it out? Because you had some sort of rational proof? No, you believe that because your science teacher told that, or you read it in a textbook, or you saw it on TV. You accept the authority of other people who you respect. Or, other things that we don't see. Maybe this is kind of a dumb example, I don't know, but there are all kinds of radio waves and who knows what else floating around in this room, right? And if we could tap into it, there's all kinds of songs and people talking and pictures and everything floating around in this room. You all believe that, right? You don't see them, but you believe them. And you could give other examples as well, but certainly there are many, many things that you and I believe in that we've never actually proved it. We've actually not seen this ourselves, but we believe it because we trust those who've told us that this is true. So why don't we trust those who know God? Why don't we trust those who've written the scriptures, who've had interaction, very real interaction with God? I think it's much the same. Or maybe it's even arrogant to insist there's no God. How about that? Maybe it's arrogant. I mean, almost all people throughout all of history, throughout the entire world, have always believed in a God of some kind. It's only a very, very small percentage of all the people that have ever lived that never have believed in a God. And even today, in this modern world, it's only a very, very small percentage of people across the entire world who don't believe in a God. So maybe it's arrogant for Richard Dawkins to say, there's no God. All the rest of you guys are just dumb who believe in that. Maybe that's arrogant. Maybe that's being narrow-minded. I was struck by that when a number of years ago, when you think back on the very first Ethiopian family that we sponsored as a church. And they got a job here in Chatham at a factory, and they got to know some of their co-workers a little bit. And they told us once, they said, after they got a chance to talk with somebody one time, they said, you know what? Some of these people that we work with, they say there's not a God. I said, that's crazy. They don't believe that there's a God. How can that be? Because these people coming from Africa, where everybody believes in the supernatural, where basically everybody has some kind of contact with the supernatural, often evil actually, the evil aspect of the supernatural. They had never in their whole life heard of anybody that didn't believe in a God. And they were just like stunned that somebody couldn't believe in something so obvious. It's a different perspective. And what about stories of contact with the supernatural? And we have to be careful with this because there's lots of strange stories out there, and there's strange people who've made up weird things. I know that. However, nevertheless, there are enough things that people have experienced, rational people with both feet on the ground, people that maybe you know, that I know, that have had some unusual experiences. Sometimes when they've been at death's door. Some of you, I am sure, have had close relatives who, as they were dying, They seemed to see something very, very real, just as they were dying. And what do we do with all of that? Just discount it? There's something very, very real that in sometimes rather unusual circumstances that people do encounter. And so we can't dismiss all of those stories. Well, that's a start. That's a start. As I said, I can only scratch the surface. And as I said, I'm not brilliant. And that's, of course, obvious once I've shared what I've shared. But I have at least done a beginning. And you know what? Probably most of you here believe in a God already, so I was just sort of reinforcing what you already thought. Perhaps I've gotten a few of you to think who have some questions, and that would be one of my goals. All of us, I think, at some point, we should ask ourselves, is God real or not? That's part of maturing. And I hope that maybe in a small way, some of what I shared, some of you can maybe use in some of your conversations with some people you know that don't believe in a God. At least it's the beginning. But, you know, belief in God is not merely an academic question. It's not merely sort of a philosophical question. Whether God exists or not is a very, very practical thing, extremely practical. And there's two levels I want to deal with just for a few minutes here at the end. As even some of the atheists have recognized, if there's a God, there's accountability. That verse that was read earlier from James is kind of startling, James 2:19, which says, you believe that there is a one God? Well, good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. Well, there is a God, and all of us in this room live in some kind of relationship with him. Demons know that there's God, but it doesn't do them any good. They're scared of God. They wish he didn't exist. So what about us? How do we respond to the fact that there's a real God out there? What's our relationship to him? If we know that he exists, if we're convinced that he exists, we're convinced that he's real, what are we doing with that knowledge? Is it just an intellectual assent? Like agreeing that 2 + 3 = 5? Quite a few years ago, one of the teachers at the Christian high school had a discussion with their class about what God might be like. And that particular year, with that particular class, the kids came up with the fact that God was sort of like a subject in school, like maybe mathematics or science or history. That's a bit scary, that God, from their point of view, was sort of an intellectual construct, not a real being who you can have a real relationship with. So what about all of you who believe in a God? Are you cultivating a personal relationship with him? Do you not only know about him, but do you know him personally? Are you in the habit of talking with him? We call that prayer. Are you in the habit of listening to him? And he speaks most clearly through his word. Are you sensitive to the promptings of his spirit? And do you follow him? Is he your shepherd? Do you recognize that you're his sheep? Do you hear his voice? Do you follow him? You know, that passage from James that was read, basically what it's saying is that it's not enough to just believe that there's a God, to have that sort of faith that there is somebody called God out there. But that passage in James says, what are you doing with it? You have to live it out. You have to respond to it. You have to live in obedience. It has to change the way you live. So that's the accountability that comes with a God who exists. And that's, of course, the passage from James that I referred to before. But you know what? In the end, if there's a God, that's a tremendous blessing. You know, actually, if I truly thought there wasn't a God, I think I'd be kind of depressed all the time. I really would, because my life would have no meaning. And I'm getting older. I turned 64 not long ago. I'm, getting near the end, realistically. And if I thought that was all there was, that'd be pretty depressing. And if I thought, and if you think about it a little bit, if I thought that my life was just basically a random life, like that my life had no significance, that everything was chance, that who knows what might happen tomorrow when it just happens willy-nilly, that would be a hard way to live. But because there is a God who revealed himself in the Word, we know that this is not a random universe which makes no sense. We know that we don't live lives that are aimless with no meaning or significance. We aren't sort of living in this universe all by ourselves. Instead, we have this all-powerful God, this God who's created this beautiful universe, this incredible universe. And this God is not that distant. He, in fact, knitted us together in our mother's wombs exactly as he wanted us to be. He knows each of your names. He knows your hurts and your wishes and your hopes and your desires. And he loves you. And he has a plan for you. And he's taking care of you. And we get to be his children. He's our Father. In fact, he even sent his Son to die for us. That's good news. It's great news that you and I live in this world with a God who's very real and who loves us. And let's go to prayer and thank him for that. Lord God, we praise you for the fact that you are very, very real, that you exist, that you made us, that you know us, that you love us, that we can have a relationship with you. And Father, this was kind of a different sermon, and I preached it only because I sensed that you wanted a message like this shared. And I prayed that you would use it to encourage those of us who believe, to kind of strengthen our faith, to maybe give us some ideas about what we can sometimes share with our non-believing friends and family members. And for those who are listening that have some doubts, and we all have doubts sometimes, but for those who have some, they're wrestling with this whole question, I pray that he would use the things that were shared. They were simple things, nothing profound, but that you would use those things to convince that you are in fact real. Thank you that we live a life which has purpose. Thank you that we can live a life which is confident, that we can look forward to the future. Thank you that you hold our lives in your hands. Thank you for your love. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Let's respond by standing and singing How Great Thou Art, which talks about the great God who created this world that we have the privilege of knowing.